Okay, well, let's get started. And as a talk says, we're going to talk about PMM and how to run MySQL better with help of PMM. And I will do like a very small presentation, and then we'll spend most of time doing a live demo. And I hope I'm more lucky than Barrett. At the keynote today. Well, and there is something else, right? If you guys have questions or comments, even it's like, say, that is the stupidest things I ever heard or seen, I have a prizes for you. Because I tried to get some, of your feedback today in the keynote, but everybody was like so quiet. So I remembered the good Russian approach, bribing. So that is what I have for you today. Candies. Yeah, so wherever going to provide some comments, questions, you can get candies, and then just like throw that to you. This way. Yes. Well, need to start to show how it works, so other people get excited. Well, anyway, so what we talk today in the morning is about the Percona Platform, right, and how PMM is taking a very important role in their Percona platform, right? One of the visuals you probably have seen, right, or maybe not, is what the Percona platform is something which we see as a comprehensive solution, which includes software as well as insights, access to the experts, and so on and so forth. You can also see that from kind of more like a structural diagram as this. Obviously, you have various like database technologies which you may be running. You may be running them on Kubernetes, right, or on plain Linux. And then we have Percona Monitor and Management as a cornerstone, which provides you a single pane of glass. Well, currently, it's more than single glass of pane, but our idea is to change that to provide all that kind of management, analytics, insight, and whatever. So one thing I wanted to talk about in this case, especially in the context of a keynote, you may have heard us talking about, well, there is certain functionality in the Percona platform which is available for everyone, and a certain functionality is going to be available to subscribers, right? So how does that play out with Percona's message, which I was kind of talking about in the morning, about claims of Percona and doing open source for real, right? How do they think about that? Well, as a CEO of a company, I have this important task to find the balance between our commitment to open source and having the sustainable business model, right? What we said. And in Percona approach, this is this, right? We have our software which we ship to you, which is completely open source. We don't have any kind of special license or kind of open core software. There is only one version. It is open source. Now, if you look at subscribers, they have additional access to our expertise, right? If you look at the past, that expertise was kind of only delivered kind of through interaction, one case at a time. What we are doing with Percona platform and inside, we're kind of packaging that in a repeatable way through those advisors, right, or knowledge base, the same sort of expertise, which is something which is only available to subscribers. You may ask, how does that play out to the, with a vendor lock-in, and how is that different, for example, what you have with AWS, Oracle, right, or whatever? Well, I think what is very important in our case is what your software is open source, right? What you run, and you can choose wherever you want to get the expertise, from Percona, which you hope you would, from maybe third-party experts. And there are actually a number of companies out there which use PMM and other sets from Percona to provide competent services, right? Which we actually are very happy about. Well, maybe our sales team is not always happy about, but I'm happy about, right? Because that is creating this very good community and ecosystem, right? And so you are not locked in with Percona. That's good for a customer, but as well as what we can be really have much bigger influence compared to what Percona would be able to do alone. Because we are not Oracle or Amazon, right? We don't have as a huge resources, and we need help, right, from ecosystem to be successful. And it is wonderful if some members of this ecosystem community are also making money while doing that, right? What it also enable you in this case is to create your own advisor configuration, right? Which may be similar to what Percona ships as through our subscription, right? So I think what is important then in this case is what nothing sort of magically stops working, right? If you stop being subscriber, as with some other cases. Another thing that I wanted to highlight is this practical question, right? You heard my keynote today, Amanda's as well, that you can say, well, there is a lot of that kind of games around open source, right? A number of companies, they like to use open source term for marketing, right? To maybe open, right? Or maybe, well, we have like open source, but if it's little addition, commons clause, which is, like a little bit of rat poison in your soup, right? Changes nothing, not at all. Small addition, right? But so what it gets very complicated in any case. And I encourage all the people, if you're looking at some solutions which are open source, right, or whatever, to ask these kind of very practical questions. Okay, you have subscribers who pay, right, and there are users which use this solution for free without paying. What is really the difference? Because that, I think, is really gives a great answer to what extent that the open source works for you, because there is a lot of games you can play. Well, anyway, that is pretty much a very short intro, as I promised. And with that, we can go to demo, right? And remember Candy. Candy, yes, we'll give now one just for being our wonderful model. Right, so that's also will give it credit where it's due. Now we'll try to gently transition to PMM. Ta-da! Okay, that worked. Isn't that wonderful? Come on, yes, full screen. Everybody can read, right? If you guys don't, there is a lot of space close by, so you can move here. So I'll go through a few things, and again, that is like a relatively free flow, loosely scripted demo, if you will. So feel free to poke around and say, "Hey, Peter, what is this?" or that. This is how the PMM home dashboard looks like, and currently it is designed for a relatively kind of small number of servers, right? Like you would see, we have overview of all the servers, which give us information about, how much, CPU is busy, memory, disk, and so on and so forth, right? And well, that is something what I would call the primary resources, right? If you think about your database performance, what really it depends on, it's, well, CPU, memory, disk, IO network, right? One of them could be bottleneck. For example, if you are oversaturating your CPU, well, chances are even good queries, simple queries, right? Maybe maybe slow, right? So with that, that is why we provide the overview of their primary resources out there. And you can see in this case some examples. They would be colored, like CPU is in kind of reddish color. That means it's, well, in relatively elevated abnormal case, like this node has CPU at 100%, right, which is, well, probably not a very good thing, right? And that is kind of, you know, some crap. You shouldn't see that, but for some reason you do. Yeah, so blue and green, right, in this case. So some of that goes from a Grafana's convention, right? So if you look at the blue, that means we do not have any thresholds. Like, for example, disk I/O. You cannot say what, oh, if you have more than 50 megabytes a second, your disk I/O is overloaded. Because you may have like some SSD which can push, you know, hundreds of megabytes or gigabytes a second, right? So that's why we don't have anything here. For CPU busy or for memory available, we do have those thresholds, right? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. And is there something in between of green and red, like yellow, like warning?
Yes, I mean, yes, there is, right? And I think what is a great thing here, right, is what a lot of this is really also customizable. We at PMM, we use Grafana for dashboarding, and one reason I was pushing to use that framework, because that gives, compared to many other tools, you know, you think about like MySQL Enterprise Monitor, MongoDB Ops Manager, right, even things like an Amazon, it's kind of very hard-coded, right? Yeah, we have some graphs, that's maybe cool, but if you want to modify that for your needs, well, options are relatively limited. And in our case, you can actually do a lot here. Now, here is an interesting thing maybe to show. Like, now, if you find here, you say, well, I cannot actually change anything, right? And the reason for that is what the dashboards you see here, which Percona provides, they're so-called provisional dashboards, provision dashboards. You cannot change them, and that is for a reason, because next time you update, and we updated certain things, it will be overwritten, right? But what you can do is you can go ahead and save it, right, to something else, right, and say that's going to be my home dashboard, and then you will find what you are now can go ahead and you can edit how it works, right? And you would be able to see, you know, here there are thresholds. Actually, it can be, you see, yellow as well, right, or like orange.
If we do the speed of our network, for example, we can set a threshold of, you know, 10 gig network.
That's right. Yeah, that is, I think, one of the challenges with network is also finding the good threshold which makes sense for everybody. Because we can say, well, CPU pegged to 100%, it's kind of always bad, wherever your stuff is, right? In terms of network, it kind of becomes more tricky, because even if you would detect, let's say, the local interface speed, that tells nothing, right? In many cases, you may be bottlenecked on the switches or something else. You may say, well, you know, yes, I have a you know, 40 gigabit Ethernet, but actually, if I'm pushing more than X, right, that is a problem, wherever. So, so yes. Okay. So, yeah, go ahead. What did you say again? Oh, that is a good question. So if you look at in PMM, we try to find a balance between you know, how much overhead we provide by capturing metrics and how they are well, providing a value, right? So in PMM, we put them into the three groups, which are sort of like a frequently sampled metrics, medium resolution, and low resolution metrics, where low resolution is something which is expensive to collect, right? And you can see what by default we collect high resolution metrics every 5 seconds, medium resolution every 10 seconds, low resolution every 60 seconds. But you can change that, right? And that is just something what we found reasonably helpful for majority of use cases. Make sense? Okay. Let's just give away candy for this gentleman here. And okay, make sure it has some sharp corners. I hope you signed your liability waiver. What?
The exhibition?
Yeah.
Yesterday afternoon, you...
Yes, you see.
Looks like you need to practice more.
Yes. It is a very special candy from for people with sense of humor. But I'll tell you more. Right? I went to Mexico with our team in Querétaro a couple of weeks ago, and I say, hey, do you have something very special so we can bring to a conference? And they say, oh yes, they have this wonderful candy, very good here, right? And then we bond a bunch of them, and then they say, hey, Peter, there is a joke on us. There is like do you know what that means? I'm saying, no, I don't know Spanish. Yes. Well, no, but they may have this name, but they don't taste as such. You can try it. They taste better. I ate a couple of those before offering you some. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's go. The second thing I will probably mention is our checks, right? As folks showed today, is what you can go to this. There's advisor checks, and that gives you a dashboard about what the checks failed, right? In this case, and you can see what checks have been done and what have been, like, for example, if you look at the high severity, you can see what that is. Some users with no passwords they're found, right? Which is a problem. Right? Or another thing you would see, well, you have a binary logs which are rotated too frequently, right? Well, that is a problem because if you rotate your binary logs too quickly, chances are you may, have your backups being unrecoverable, right? And have number of those suggestions which you put in the different categories, right? And then it also provide you little help if you want to do more. Now, I think what is also important in this case, like you can find saying, well, you know what, some of those things are not applicable to me, right? For whatever reason, I know what I am doing, right? And then you can silence those checks, right? A little bit kind of design limitation, if you will, right now, right? You kind of silence them on per instance basics, right? There, if I would say, well, you know what, I know what I'm doing, MySQL users with no passwords are fine, I probably would want to say, well, to silence them either for, let's say, all my development environment, right? Or, everything, not to do it one node at a time, right? Especially if you have many nodes. Okay.
Question on that. So,
well, so what? Yeah. So what is going to do in this case? If you silence it, that means what you are not going to. It's not going to pop up. So in this case, as we had like file checks, summary in this case, it didn't refresh so far, but it should not. Should not. What's it?
The home page, the dashboard.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Shows as one of those counts. I guess
so it still shows out here, right? Yeah. Oh, maybe. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Are the checks extensible? Can I write my own company?
Yes. Yeah. That's I was talking about. Like right now, it's like there is documentation how to do that. It's a little bit more hairy. You don't just edit that through web interface, but there is already a solution to do that, and we are planning to make it more extensible, because in some cases you'll also want to extend the check again to limit that scope, right, or or something. Yes, look at that. We have like 2 more people with questions. You're going, yes. So the gentleman right here. Yes, okay, and well, why don't just you pass it backward to the gentleman in white shirt, so I don't try to kill somebody.
You're not taking chances anymore.
Yes, just.
So what if in the case when you've got a check that's like flapping,
Uh-huh.
we're hitting that critical threshold, but then it clears, but then we continue to hit.
Okay.
Will the silence be sticky or just every time?
Okay, so yes, in this case, the silence is tricky, and I would also point out, right, that if you look at design right now, right, there are 2 different concepts exist in PMM. One is alerts, right, and that is something which is kind of checking in the real time based on the data. Another is those the advisor checks, right, which are more something which runs every so often, right? Once a day, once an hour, right? That is something where you say, hey, you know what? If you are like in this case, like user password, right? And if in this case, this can be much more advanced, but they may be also much more causing more load on the database, right? Maybe examining your schema, right, or something like that, which you do not want to be, as if alerts kind of check in every second. Okay. Okay, good question, folks. Thank you. Okay, so the next thing I would show in this case is their information about their node. Now, I come from, I don't know, let's maybe like a system engineering background, right? And for me, the like hardware operating system, that is something I always have a lot of interest in. And I think if you look at the databases, like the database runs on the foundation of your operating system and hardware. If there are some problems in that area, even perfectly tuned, perfect database with perfect schema would not function well. And that is something where we provide their node information, right, which again gets an overview here. Some of you may be familiar. We have this little tool with a system summary that is an output from Percona toolkit tool, which gives us some additional system information, right, which is not easily presentable like metrics, and we have a bunch of information, right? CPU as a primary resource. What we have here, in addition to CPU, besides their utilization metrics, information about the saturation, right? What is the difference here, right? Well, if you think, for example, you're seeing their CPU pegged at 100%, right? That may mean, well, I just have like 1%, one process, one CPU, that process is running, right? And it is using 100% CPU, right? While I have 100% CPU usage, at the same time, my system is actually running quite optimally, right? Because there is nothing waiting, nothing would benefit from having more CPU being available. In other case, if you still have another, 100 CPU processes, for example, waiting on CPU to become available, that is much a bigger problem, right? And that is what we see in their information from their saturation standpoint, where you can see how many runnable CPUs, runnable processes exist per CPU core, right? So that often gives you information about to what extent that's overloaded. What you also track here is a maximum core usage. In this case, as a small demo box, it has some, only one CPU core, so it's not very meaningful. But otherwise, it is, especially in MySQL, because one thing with MySQL is single query in MySQL uses single CPU core, right? So it is very possible that you may have a lot of CPU available, but one of the CPU cores is pegged, right? Because you are just maybe running some bad job, right, or something. If one of your CPU cores is pegged, that may mean that you have certain CPU bottleneck, even if your overall CPU usage is not particularly high. Right. So memory utilization, that is another thing. What I like to talk about the memory utilization is this kind of a concept of a physical memory and a virtual memory, which includes swap, right? The thing in this case, if you are running out of virtual memory, then what is going to happen? You know, MySQL will crash, start crash recovery, nothing good, right? So while running out of physical memory and causing a little bit of swap is maybe, you know, performance impact, the running out of virtual memory is crash, right? So that is why we want to measure that separately, and generally having swap is cheap, right? So I would avoid situation where you run out of virtual memory. Another thing what I think is interesting is a number of people would talk about, wow, I want to make sure there is no swap going on, right? Well, no swap space used, sorry, right? Now, in reality, Linux kernel can be quite smart, and it can, you know, dump stuff which is not used in the swap space, making more memory available, which is especially, I think, important on the smaller, maybe development VMs, right? Because in this case, like saving, you know, putting half a gig of junk to the swap file can be very meaningful. Of course, if you have like, you know, half a terabyte of memory, it's not so meaningful, right? But that is not, I think, looking at the swap space is not as, usage is not as important, right? In this case, for example, we see about, you know, 500 megabytes of swap space used. What you want to really look at is amount of swap I/O, right? Generally, you expect on a well-operating system with the swap in, swap out to be 0, right? Or maybe kind of, you know, single digits kilobytes a second, right? If it's really going to tens, hundreds of megabytes a second, well, that is a tell sign what you have overcommitted your memory, right? Maybe allocated too much memory as a cache, right? Then it's sustainable. That is a bad idea. Now the next key resource that we spoke about is disk, right? In terms of disk, I like looking at I/O activity, right? And we here separated by the reads and writes because depending on your I/O subsystem, the performance systems can have latency for reads and writes, and it's very separate, right? Because there may be some caching going on, right? Or on the contrary, right, you may have some, you know, write acknowledgement, right, to persist the data taking time. In any way, right, I think it's good to look at I/O separately, right? Or also, if you look at your kind of, let's say, network attached storage, right, you have a separate in and out bandwidth, right? So it's make sure to look at that separately. But looking at how much I/O bandwidth you are consuming, it's often not very meaningful unless you know what is your system I/O capacity is, which unfortunately we cannot really detect automatically, right? Because even if, you know, people tell you, oh, this thing can handle so many I/Os a second, that's typically in some, you know, best case scenario, right? It's not really usable. But what is usable, in my opinion, is looking at your I/O latency and comparing that to historical. So what you can see in this case, right, is you can see those dots which corresponds to the current latency, right? And you can see this line which shows their latency average for last period of time. So typically, if you would see your I/O system oversaturated, you will see their latency jump, right, above what is normal for your system, right? That is kind of maybe like a little bit complicated, but a good way to understand when your I/O system is saturated.
So you mentioned on the graph above the I/O activity. You don't know what the upper bound and there would be on
That's right.
What about the INO capacity setting?
Oh, yeah. Well, INO IO capacity setting, right? It's kind of tricky, right? It limits only some kinds of write IO, right? It would not, for example, limit a write to a log, in a DB log, binary log file, and even from flashing standpoint, in many cases you would see in a DB override that limit if it really needs to flash status, flash a data, right? So I would not, so you shouldn't think in like, oh my gosh, in a DB never ever will exceed in a DB IO capacity. But yeah, good question. You go to Candlery, right?
Yeah, I got some.
Okay. Okay, great. Great. Yeah. The next one, we talk about the network traffic. Again, it's hard to look at the limit, but here is something which I think is very important with network, which a lot of people may not think about, right? You may have network performance problems coming from your bandwidth oversaturated, but in many cases it rather happens due to errors, right? Because when a packet's dropped, when a wait happens before we have to be retransmitted. And in this regard, I like to look at local network errors, right? That means like on the interface of that server, you would want that to be like pretty much zero, right? You should not be getting that. If you have, and maybe you have some, some problem with network card, driver, right, or maybe cabling. But what is the most important, though, I think, is this, the TCP/IP retransmit, right? Because that tells you how many packages get lost somewhere between your client and server, right? And I'm using like some very, cheap hosting for this one, right? So you can see the retransmit here is not particularly healthy, but it's not super bad either. But in many cases, if you have my clients are timing out, right? There's like some unexpected delays out there, some queries which are normally fast, taking a long time. Often you look at TCP retransmit and saying, oh, yeah, that is where a problem happens. Make sense? Okay. Moving up a layer, of course, there is a MySQL summary, right, which tells us what information about MySQL, summary, connections, what is going on a different levels, right, where you can find what kind of problems may be happening. I will highlight maybe a couple of things here, right, so don't go like graph by graph. One thing which I use a lot is this, right, is thread connected versus threads running, right? So if you look at MySQL in a standard configuration, each client will have a thread like allocated to it, right? So what happens when a client sends a query, right? Then that query being kind of executed, then result is sent back, and then that thread is essentially idle, waiting for connections to come. And if you look in many cases, you will have a lot of connections which are just sitting out there being idle, right? Now, in case there is a lot of queries comes in, though, right, you can have a lot of queries trying to be processed by MySQL at the same time, and in this case, you'll have threads running like some large number. In many cases, like exceeding number of available CPU cores by many times, and that is not very good for performance, right? Both because we just have to wait competing for CPU, but also because they kind of tend to step on each other's shoes with internal locking and so on and so forth, right? So if you can see their number of threads running spiking to some significant number, right, well exceeding especially your CPU cores, that is often a problem. And in this case, you can see we have a kind of two numbers. One is threads running, and then average number of threads running. I like to look at the average number of threads running first. Why? Because if you think about this, queries coming in, they come, or you can model that as random arrivals, right? And if you from a kind of statistical theory, right? If you have something coming up at random interval, yes, there is always a chance that many of them are going to arrive at exactly the same interval, right? So even if a modest query rate, you often would have some outliers. It's like, boom, you have like 50 queries running at once, but they disappeared the next second, and that is not a problem. If you have, like, for example, 100 queries kind of running for a long time, it's getting 100, 200, 300, and then it goes down, right, over a period of, let's say, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. That is typically correspond to a period when your server was overloaded, right, and having issues. Make sense? Not just 1 second and gone. Okay. The other thing I want to highlight, I think this one is command counters, is very helpful. What does command counters tells us is what kind of traffic MySQL server is having. Com select corresponds to select queries, update corresponds to update queries, insert queries, and so on and so forth. Right, there is a little interesting thing here to know is this double counting. Right, like in this case we have, you see, com stmt execute. That corresponds to executing of prepared statements, which are also additionally going to be counted in respective com command, right? So select prepared statement will be in executed prepared statement as well as select, right? So sometimes you'll say, well, like if I look at number of com commands, it's larger than number of overall queries, right? Which we, yeah, like, where do we flow it out there? It should be somewhere here, no? Yeah, like MySQL questions, right? You may have total number of com commands exceeding that number, which doesn't make sense unless you look at that. Look at double counting. Okay, with that, let me also switch to another tool, right? Which is something what is kind of custom built by Percona, which is more than sort of like getting data and plotting it in Prometheus, and this is their query analytics tool. Right? What we have designed in PMM2 specifically is what by default you're not looking at one server, you're looking at all your fleet, like all my servers, and looking at what exactly generate the loads on all your fleet of servers. By default, we show you sort of like a spark line by the term which is called load, which is something which I, again, from my systems engineering standpoint, called load because that's very similar to load average, right? If you know what load average on Linux is, that is kind of how many, processes are either running or kind of like blocked, like pretty much. The same thing is here. Load corresponds to how many average number of queries which has been executed at the time. So if I see here and you say, well, the load is 18, that means on all my servers at that time, in average, were number of 18 queries executed, right? So you can also think about that. I think Amazon, when they call it the average active sessions, right? That is pretty much the same thing. Now, what is interesting in PMM, it's you do not have to look at your load from a standpoint of queries. You can also look at that, for example, from server names, right? In this case, server instance as well. In this case, I know what if I from this picture what MySQL 4 for some reason is well overloaded, right? It has much more load compared to other instances. Right? And that often can be very meaningful, right? Especially if you have a shard and say, well, all those servers should have approximately the same load, but some for some reason one of them acting up, right? I may want to look at that instead of trying to chase it on a per query basis, right? We can also look at that on per schema basics. Again, can be very helpful if you have a sharding client per schema. You can say, hey, you know what? I have a whole bunch of schemas on my fleet of servers, right? I click on that and can say, oh, I have this schema which corresponds to a customer XYZ. That is the most problematic, right? And then you may be able to drill down on that, right? Username, also very helpful. If you follow best practices and you have different applications using different usernames rather than shared, then you can see, and you have like a multi-tenant from, well, application standpoint database, you can know what application is causing load on the traffic. And finally, you can look at the client hosts, right? Also quite helpful. I have seen in so many cases people say, well, we have many web servers and one of them was not updated, right? And it's causing, because of that, some bad queries which you thought we got rid of, right? Or you may have one of the hosts misconfigured, for example, and it's not hitting memcache correctly, and because of that, it's kind of sends 10 times queries, right? What you would expect it to sell. So you would be able to see all of that through those ways. Okay. Let me go back to the queries then and kind of show some other features which are helpful. By default, we show a load because we think that is the most relevant in this case, right? Because you may have a lot of queries, but they are fast, right? And it's not more important. Or we may have like relatively few queries, but they are like really hairy bad queries, right? And then you would want to elevate them. But you can also sort by the query time, and you can also make any metric sort of like the main metric, right? Like if you case, hey, you know what? But I really want to understand what are the queries which are most frequent queries in your applications. You can either sort by the query count or even make a query count main metric, and you will see that. And you can see in this case is what while this kind of a select by a primary key query, it's is the most frequent query on my whole fleet of servers, it actually does not generate majority of the load, right? It's not the main thing. Another thing what we have here printed by default is a query time. We show the average, but also average is kind of not a very helpful number in many cases, right? Databases, users don't suffer because of the average query times typically, but because of outliers. And because of that, you can see with a tooltip more information, right? Both the average query time, you can also see maximum, average, and 99th percentile query times, right? Which can be more meaningful to you. In many cases, you may want also to look some other stuff. Like if you look and say, well, you know what? I really want to understand what queries are, I don't know, let's say, doing sort a lot of rows, right? I can add the information about the sort rows, right? And that will, in this case, a little bit kind of, you can see it's NA for many. Yes, you see, okay, suffering. Huh, it's not showing me anything here. You see, that is when you're doing experiment. Yeah, 1 second. Do you know why it's broken? No. No, I thought you were going to advise me saying, hey, Peter. Yes, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think I said this, but anyway, so I think what the point is, like, sometimes certain things were not available with a certain kind of data source, right? But anyway, I'm kind of slightly surprised.
Well, just click the up of the sort instead of the down.
No, you see, it doesn't want. Well, anyway. Anyway, yes, let's get you opportunity to ask you questions. That's always, you know, like probably a bug. You know, we have like a person here is like they say, oh, say shit, like probably a bug. Right, yes, but we won't point finger to him because he. Oh yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, I can tell you there are many bugs here, right? And I am unfortunate, hopeful we will add even more bugs because you cannot add features without bugs. Right? Okay, yeah, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, so when you were looking at that, when you were hovering over and it was showing you, you know, your average, your max, etc.
Yeah.
You're hovering over the query time.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to drill down into that maximum to find out? Because you're looking at your totals here. Is there a way to find out what query that was from that tooltip?
Oh, okay. So yeah, so you can, right? So if you look look at this case, right? You can look at the query, and then you will go and see a lot more information, right? About about that specific query. When you can also go to see their examples. Right, we typically choose examples in this case, like based on kind of a worst case, right? So that you typically see the query in this case here, if that is a particularly bad example, right? In this case, they're all the same, but another you may say yes because of for that values, right? So yes, that is something. And now, what I think is also important is what we actually have in the database many samples. Right, so far we have not displayed many of them. That is something what I would like to get to us to get you maybe like a, you know, scatter plot, right, or something of the examples which we have in a database, right, so you can explore. Oh, look at that! That query had, I don't know, a lot of time or maybe a lot of rows examined, right? So you can play with examples because often for the same query pattern you actually have a different examples, different execution plans or something. Okay. Oh, good. Okay. So yeah, but you guys got me curious. Why doesn't it work? I won't be able to sleep tonight. Okay, yeah. Let's maybe show like some more. Do we have some more interesting select? Oh yeah, maybe this is select, distinct, la la la. Doesn't do order, or maybe in this case we don't.
There's no sorting at all in those queries.
Yeah, maybe that's kind of there is no sorting. But let's see. In this case, here you can see. Oh yeah, so I got it because I usually when I use this demo, I think I use TMP table size instead of sorting, right? And that works. And now I probably have no sorting in this benchmark. But anyway, so in this case, right, kind of drilling down more on a specific query and showing a couple of things which I find interesting. I think what is interesting in this case, like first we have a spark line for a whole bunch of different metrics, right? And sometimes you may have some of them sort of like a spike in, but not another, right? You'll say, well, you know what, number of queries stays static, but log time jumps. Oh, that's some problem with row-level logs, right? Or you may have, well, you know what, I have for some reason init byte thread elevated. What that could be, well, maybe something happened like in my cache got washed out. And because of that, the same kind of type of queries coming in the same rate requiring a lot more more I/O, right? So I think being able to see all the spark lines together can be very very helpful. Another thing what you can have here is what those kind of yellowish color, right? It gives you some of the additional data points which I find a helpful ratio. So for example, in this case, you can see, well, the query has certain time spent in log time. But what is important here is what that is less than 0.1%. Right? So that query does not cause any lock-in at all. Right? Where if you would click on that query in particular, right? It's not also shown, but it's kind of higher, right? Update query typically gets more of the log. Another interesting setup, interesting ratio, right? What I like to see is this, right? We have a metric of how many rows has been examined to serve result, and that is a pretty much measure of a CPU efficiency of a given query, right? The more rows you have to crunch, the more CPU that wastes, right? Even if all the data is in cache, right? So in this query in particular, it has 3,000 rows examined for each row sent, right? That is not very efficient. Why are we using ratio? Because if you think about the queries which sends back, let's say, 10,000 rows, what is the minimum possible number of rows it can look at to send that 10,000 rows? Well, it's 10,000, right? Now, in reality, is because you may be using joins or something like that. Like if you have two tables joined, to send you 10,000 rows, right? That will be, well, guess what? 20,000 row combinations, right? Which are both always counted as rows examined, even if it's same row looked at twice, right? So what I am looking in this case, if you're looking at the query and the number of, and that's not like some aggregate query, right? Then unless you're just having less than 10 rows examined per row sent, that typically means query is not using indexes appropriately or something. So that is a very helpful in my opinion, right? And then it gives you a bunch of other ratios here. Okay, yes, I think I am pretty much out of time. Yes, but I hope that was helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
How is the DBA alerted whenever there's an issue?
What's that? How does DBA?
How are they alerted? Do they send them an email, or is there?
Oh, okay. So with alerting, right, there is alerting integrated now, right, and we're still working on. It has number of integration, right? So that's maybe email, PagerDuty, webhook, right, and others. Right, but right now I would say it's not yet integrated with queries, right? So you can say, well, please send me alert if that query is taking more than kind of 5 seconds. Yeah.
Another question. So how it works in terms of the installation of the tools? So as I understand, it can be installed separately, like the Grafana itself with the dashboard and some kind of agents on this.
That's right. So if you look at this case, the setup is we have a package PMM, right, which includes all the components it needs, right, and then you have the agent, right, which you install on the nodes. Now, in certain cases, let's say if I want to monitor Amazon Aurora, right, or something, you cannot do that. We also have an agentless mode, right, where you can pretty much go to their interface, right, and go to add instance and say, hey, I go to Amazon RDS and other instance. You can also do that, but in this case, we'll have a less data available because we cannot get everything in one.
What about a single node with multiple MySQL DB instances, like in the case of the tests?
Yes, you can do that.
So just one agent?
Well, yeah, that's right. So if you look at one agent, right, when you configure that agent, you can tell it there is multiple MySQL nodes, right? That is, one thing. If you see in this case, there is a separation between the node and the instance, because on one node you can have as many MySQL instances as you want.
So with Amazon, you need to create kind of an IAM or something like that?
Well, if you just deploy it on Amazon, you can deploy PMM from Amazon Marketplace.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The user on the instance to read it.
What?
Amazon, you connect via the user and you basically just grab all the metrics.
In Amazon RDS,
Mhm.
the metrics that you capture from to PMM,
Mhm.
it's all the metrics from CloudWatch, or you got metrics from Performance Insights if it's enabled on the RDS?
Yeah. So well, what you get the data? We'll get data from MySQL, right, or Postgres and MySQL. It will come from performance schema. Then for Amazon specifically, we have integration to Grave Cloud Watch metrics as well, right? But it is more limited compared to what we can get from from Linux, right? So you will have certain things like disk I/O, CPU usage, but it's may not be as exact as we get from from Linux. Okay.
Is there any plans to push agents out from the PMM server to the nodes?
What do you mean?
Like today, there's no ability. I don't know if PMM has an ability. Like if I have a central PMM server, right? And if I have a new MySQL instance, can I push the agent out from the central server to the?
Oh, I see. You mean like have an installation?
Correct.
Yeah. So so far no, right? And I think if you look at this case, the reason for that is also because it's kind of a little bit hairy, if you will, right? And I think maybe given kind of PMM node too much of that kind of control, right? You have to basically give like unrestricted SSH access, right? Or
plans to create a secret store or something like that.
Yeah, no. So far it doesn't do that, but obviously we can consider, right? So right now our model was in this case more of, if you think about how you would use Datadog, right, or something, and saying, hey, you have this kind of endpoint to which you push the data, right, and then you set up the monitoring sort of, well, as a part of your provisioning of a database node. Go ahead.
Assuming that you have like few different accounts, few different Amazon accounts.
Yeah.
You want to control them with probably one PMM server. Which will sit probably on one of the EC2 of one account. How would you spread it between them? Like assuming I have 3 Amazon accounts.
Yeah.
On one account, I'm building the server, the PMM server on EC2. How do I communicate to the other 2?
Well, I mean, if you look at the PMM standpoint, right, those things are kind of very decoupled, right? You can have PMM, let's say, deployed in some, data center, right, through Docker and monitor RDS, right? As long as it has a network connection, it can do that, right? Or opposite, I can deploy it on an AMI and can then monitor a server somewhere far away, right? So in this case, that is not a problem, right? If you want to have a separate account, as long as PMM server has privileged access.